I spent the past 2 weeks animating and implementing the cooking recipe for the jelly manual cooking process. So, first, I'll go into how it's animated, and then later on, I'll talk about how I implemented it and the considerations I had to take into account. So, we're in A Sprite right now. We have our large saucepan, the heating controls over here, then we have our guidance from the chef in the upper left corner. I want to make the cooking process as interactive as possible, so I've decided to animate the process of adding in each ingredient. This jelly recipe only calls for the dewdrop, which is like the water. So I've animated water falling into the pot and also the process of filling the pot up. And then the next part in this game is you're gonna have to heat up the stove and the dewdrop is going to boil. So I've animated when it's on low, so it's simmering at this point, and then when it's on medium temperature, it'll be a bit more larger bubbles and a bit faster. And then finally, when it's boiling, it'll be the most chaotic. So that's the stove heating process. The next thing I had to animate was filling the jelly tin with water. So for this, I decided to take the same asset as the pot with the dewdrop in it, and I've drawn a way larger jelly tin. You can see the smaller version here in the material section. And I've also made a threshold here. This white line is where you want to target hitting the pour level to. As part of pouring the pot, in the game I've implemented it so that as you move the pour direction closer to when it's like fully pouring, it will actually rotate the pot. But in order to show that the water is also being affected by that gravity, I have animated what the water looks like as it moves from stable to being tipped sideways. So this asset here is just a rough asset so I could see where the water should be pouring from. So it starts off by dripping like this, and see this is how it starts pouring. And once it's actually pouring, this is like a continuous loop. And then I've also had to separately animate the process of the mold filling up with the dewdrop. So it's filling and you want to be around here, but let's say you kept going. I've drawn the failure state. So this would be when it's like fully overflown and you haven't filled it properly, so the game would fail you at that point. I've added some buffer to this threshold, so you could technically be like a couple frames before and after the threshold. I'll probably go back and actually thicken the threshold line on here so that it's more obvious. So just like with making jelly in real life, once you've boiled that water, you want to let it set and cool off. So you'd refrigerate it. So I've drawn the outer refrigerator and then also the interior part of the fridge. And we have our larger filled jelly, and this is going to be transformed into this pink jelly. It is a fantasy game, so in reality, would you expect a color to change like this? Probably not. But as it's a game, I'm just going with it. But here with this scene, I have created a timer. Well, once it's in the fridge, of course, you need to plate the jelly, take it out of the container. So this is the reveal step, and I've drawn a huge asset version of the jelly, which looks honestly different from the smaller icon, but I think it doesn't really matter. It's gonna be okay. So there we have that. We have our large plate. Then after you completed everything, you'll have this larger like success screen where it shows you what you made, how much experience you got. And it's also possible for you to fail to make the recipe. So we have a failure state too. So that is everything. I think some key things here is that I'm gonna pull from anime where not everything is a complex animation. This took quite a while to do. Perhaps for some ingredients, it's just gonna be like a gravity is making it fall into the pot and you don't have the ingredient transforming. But for water, I thought it would make sense because it's regularly used. It'll probably be used in a lot of recipes. When I was working on this, there was another key decision I had to make, which is, do I really want to draw the image of every single metal tier utensil? Previously, I decided that I would allow you to create the same utensil in every single metal type, and this would kind of allow you to use all the metals throughout the game because you'd need to craft each metal tier a certain amount of times to reach the next level. But I think it adds a lot of complexity to the game, both for crafting, but then also for having to draw these huge utensils and perhaps for future animations going forward. So I really simplified it. I went back and changed the implementation so that utensils only use one kind of metal, not programmatically defined. So as you level up the tier, it changes things like how many uses you get out of each utensil or how many ingredients you need. Now it's statically defined. So I have set it up so that for the jelly tin and the baking tray, it's using copper bars. And then for the mixing bowl and cake pan, you're using bronze. And then for this saucepan, you're using coal. So it's still taking advantage of the different materials. And things like the saucepan and the baking tray are going to be things that you need throughout the game. Same for the mixing bowl and cake pan. So that's another way to make sure that different metals earlier in the game are still relevant later on. Additionally, I've updated the utensil recipe so that we can now craft this coal saucepan with our coal material. Now that we've seen the animation, let's go into the game and see it in action. I've just tacked it on here for now so that we can just launch this manual cooking process and I could focus on implementing it. I'd still want to completely rework this stove because, as I said before, I don't want it to be so much of an idle game that you're just cooking things automatically, which are very powerful ingredients. I want it to be more player-based, real economy kind of thing. I haven't reworked it yet, but I am definitely planning on it. You can see here we have our new ingredient, our saucepan and our jelly tin and the dewdrop that's necessary. So for this process, there's a bunch of different sounds that I've added. I'm just going to walk through it. There is some validation for what you can put on here, but it's expecting a saucepan before it moves on. And you can see here I've set it up to heat to different levels. I may want to add further rigor, like you have to do this by a certain amount of time. Right now it's very permissive, so you want to go to high and then it will count down here and then move on to the next step when it's done. I've also set it up so that you have to drag everything into place. Another thing to consider will be, do I want to have it already set up and you just have to do the pour step, or do I want to keep it like that? So right now I'm working through the successful route. And you can see here the jelly was turning into the completed pink version. And finally, it shows you that you finished the recipe and then you gain experience. And you can see I've drawn this little happy version of this NPC. It has a crying version too. I'll go through a failed example so you can see what I'm talking about. The only way to fail in this recipe is to spill over the jelly tin or to stop too early. So for here, I'm just gonna let it overflow. Oh yeah, you can see now it's crying. So yeah, that's our cooking process. In order to implement this, I had to split the cooking process into 8 different kinds of steps and programmatically represent things like, do you want to change from the stove to the countertop, and the countertop to the fridge, things like that. And then for each kind of thing that you can do, like heating the stove to a certain level, or pouring amount of liquid, or lifting up the utensil, or adding an ingredient, I had to specify different parameters, like which ingredient should we be using, which utensil are we using, what is the final byproduct of it. Because for some parts of this process, it does create byproducts or like intermediary cooking items. For example, when we fill the jelly tin, we then represent that with a new byproduct item, which is a filled jelly tin. And then once we cool it, we have a new byproduct, which is the cooled byproduct. And I've made all of these so that when it comes time to representing them in the database, it should be fairly straightforward to adapt that. And I also did that because during the cooking process, we want to drag the byproducts around. I've drawn the smaller icon versions of them here, which correspond to the larger assets I've also created. When I first started implementing this process, I wanted to make it so that everything was backed by a data model right away. But as I worked on it, I realized that perhaps I'm modeling pretty complex relations or interactions that you need to do for each recipe. And I would like to have more examples to generalize from before I get into the business of creating database models and having to do data migrations or rewrite data to represent what are essentially a lot of in-game interactions. So it's possible that I'll keep them all just packaged within the game, but it's also fairly likely that I'll make a data model for them later on and make it more concrete. Regardless, I have used my knowledge from the whole migration of converting everything from game objects to data model objects to make sure that the game objects I've created for the cooking process will be very easy to convert over. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how the cooking process is animated, but I do think that there's some room for improvement to make things more smooth. I did find a bunch of cooking sounds, and I think that's really useful, but I think there needs to be more pauses between each step and perhaps like some feedback, like good job, or having that success symbol whenever you complete something. So it just lingers a bit more on each step before just speeding on forward, so you know that you've actually completed it well, beyond just knowing that through it progressing to the next step. And perhaps it'll be a good idea to reduce the friction by just having the utensil in place rather than having the player need to drag it into place. The player already needs to drag the ingredients, and this is supposed to be one of the easiest recipes to make, so that's something I could take into account in the future. So that's all for the cooking process for now. Now that we've worked on this huge feature of the game, which is honestly one of the core features of the game because it's a culinary game, I do want to start fleshing out the content of the game, which means implementing things like the future monster animations, creating more quest lines, improving monster combat and spells, and then also animating more recipes, more cooking recipes as I come across them. We already have quite a few few meals where the monsters either drop the recipe or you can get the recipe through a quest line. So I'm going to need to go through all of these items as well and actually animate them. So learning a bit from my past mistakes, which is the mistake of just focusing on one type of task and just doing that for 2 weeks straight or months straight, I'm going to try to do a bit of each thing as I go along in this process, while also making sure that there aren't too many bugs. So that's all for today. Thanks for taking the time to watch. Subscribe if you'd like to continue following this game development journey, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks with the next update.